Alrighty, we are in the home stretch of part 1 of pulmonary physiology, and we're going to talk about work of breathing. Alright, so what influences the work of breathing? What are dynamic versus static forces? How does your work of breathing change if you breathe more quickly or more deeply? What parameter changes work most with fast, deep breathing? And how do people with pulmonary disease, namely obstructive and restrictive disease, adapt their breathing patterns to minimize their work of breathing, and why do they do that? All right, so this is a diagram I found on the internet, and I just love it. Here is change in pressure, and it's measured in pascals or centimeters of water, but these are units of pressure. So as you change pressure, you get air into the lungs. As you change pressure, you get air out of the lungs. Our 0 point starts at FRC, so what's ever above FRC, so this tells you the size of our tidal volume. Now, as we inspire, this is the curve of the breathing. And then as we expire, this is the curve of the breathing. So, remember last time when I told you about that thing called hysteresis? One might expect in lungs that compliance would be linear, as it is in blood vessels, and that it would be the same whether you put volume in or volume out. I don't know if you remember that, but when we talked about blood vessels, we'd say if you change the volume, what happens to the pressure? And compliance of arteries is really high. I'm sorry, the compliance of the arteries was low. It has high elastance because with a very little volume you had a lot of pressure, and for veins wasn't very much at all. You had a big change in volume and a very little change in pressure. So this is the folks that took 15 last semester. If you weren't with us, don't sweat it, we'll catch up. Alrighty, we plot things a little different in the lungs. Notice delta P is on the x-axis and delta V is on the y-axis because we do it differently. In the lungs, you change the pressure, then you change the volume. And we might expect that to be a linear relationship and be the same whether you're putting volume in or volume out, but it's not. It's different. Inspiration is different than expiration. So we have a hysteresis. Why is that? Well, when you analyze this pressure volume curve, we can get something called work and talk about the work of breathing. Just as we could do pressure volume curves in the cardiovascular system and get something called external work. We can do the same kind of things in the lungs. And what happens is the work of inspiration is determined by this entire volume, or this entire area. Part of it is due to airway resistance, and part of it is due to the elastic forces, the surface tension and the characteristics of your lung. This green part here is the work during expiration, and notice it's only due to airway resistance. We also have some obstructive lung disease put on here, but I have another picture. We'll talk about that a little later. All right. So here's a little simpler diagram, and I have some area in here, but the area here isn't as big or is bigger than the one in the other diagram, but just bear with me. We can do a pressure volume curve, so transpulmonary pressure, volume above FRC, from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 7 back to 1. That's the total during inspiration. It's got two parts. It's got this little sliver here, that has to do with airway resistance. And then we've got this whole part here that has to do with compliance, which is surface tension and the tissue. So notice, if you take a bigger breath versus a smaller breath, that taking a smaller breath would decrease your compliance work a lot. So this kind of work has to do with the characteristics of the lungs no matter what they're doing. So this is called the static part of work. This work occurs because air is moving. So this is called the dynamic part of work. All right? So static has to do with the surface tension, the tissue characteristics, and the compliance. Dynamic work has to do with airflow, and that has to do with airway resistance. So I'm going to, oh Lord have mercy, that's not what I meant to do. I'm going to try to find my eraser and see if I can get rid of some of this stuff. Okay. And now I'm going to get a pen back if I can. Alrighty. Now, right here, 2 to 5 to 4 to 6 is the total of expiration. And it's all dynamic. Now, why the heck is that? Why is the work of breathing, of inhalation, so much bigger than the work of expiration? Now, isn't that kind of intuitive? Did you maybe think of that already? What do you have to do to inhale? You have to contract some muscles. You have to overcome surface tension. You got to stretch out your elastin and your collagen. You have to burn up a bunch of ATP to do that. And you have to move the air through the airways. But what do you have to do to exhale? All you have to do is relax. All you have to do is stop contracting the muscles. All you have to do is let the recoil forces of the lung let you get back to your starting place. So you don't have static work during exhalation, but you still have to move the air through the airways, and so you have dynamic work during exhalation. So this is, again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 1. This whole thing is the static work during inspiration. Just this little sliver here is dynamic work during inspiration. This little sliver here is dynamic work during expiration. Basically, we have no static work during expiration because the recoil forces and the surface tension help us get back to our resting position. Now, if you have restrictive lung disease, you have low compliance. It is hard to inhale. So look what you're going to do. You're going to reduce your tidal volume. So if you take a smaller tidal volume, you reduce your static work because that's your problem. Now notice how curved this is. Now there's no time on this graph. I don't know what this person's respiratory rate is, but I do know this. If a person's going to maintain their alveolar ventilation and they're taking smaller breaths, they're going to have to breathe more times. That's just all there is to it. They're going to have to breathe more times. So you're going to be moving air through the airways a lot more. So you're going to increase your dynamic work. and that shows in this bowed out curvature. So people with restrictive lung disease, like tuberculosis, like fibrosis, like pulmonary edema, they're going to take tinier breaths and they're going to breathe faster. They are minimizing their static work, which is their problem. They're going to maximize their dynamic work, which is not their problem. Now, obstructive work of breathing. These folks are going to take bigger breaths. Why? Because they can expand. Now, it's not easy to take a bigger breath because it's hard for these folks to exhale. So there's a little caveat here. If you have obstructive disease, particularly chronic pulmonary disease, obstructive disease, you can inhale, you can expand. You don't necessarily have a problem with compliance. The problem is as you exhale, your airway resistance is so high, it's hard to get the air out. So you don't mind taking a bigger breath, but you have to slow your respiratory rate. You have to slow down the airflow because you're trying to minimize your dynamic work. That's your problem. So there's no time on this graph, but I can see that this person is trying to minimize their dynamic work by slowing their respiratory rate. So people with chronic obstructive lung disease will do something called pursed lip breathing. Does a couple of things. By pursing their lips, they slow their exhalation. So they add something called PEEP, positive end expiratory pressure. That helps keep their airways open. And by slowing the flow of the air, they decrease their dynamic work. It allows them to take larger, slower breaths. Now, they're going to have an increased work of breathing, but it's going to be better than if they hadn't done that. What can happen in these patients if they don't use this pursed lip breathing is that they breathe in and they get agitated and they can't exhale. So they can't take a breath in because they can't exhale, and then they're at the top of their lungs going because it's hard to take a breath in if you can't get the breath out. So they have to work with a respiratory therapist and learn how to do this pursed lip breathing so they can slow their breathing down and minimize their airway resistance. Now, what if you hyperventilate? If you breathe more deeply, you're going to increase your tidal volume. That's going to increase your static work. But if you also breathe faster, you're going to move the air faster, and that's going to increase your dynamic work. So people, if they're hyperventilating, deep breathing and fast breathing are going to increase both components. Alrighty, now we're at the end of this presentation. Whether you're viewing these presentations before lecture or after lecture, look at your notes, look at the outline I've provided for you, think about what your questions are, think about those study questions that I've provided. That's the best way to prepare for the exams. Bring your questions to class or put them on the forum or email them to me, whatever, but let's get to your questions so you can get a good handle on the material. And I look forward to seeing you all in class. Bye for now.